Hello, and welcome to today's lecture. We're going to kick off today by thinking about a quote from a very famous political scientist called E.E. Schattschneider. In his opinion, political parties created democracy. Modern democracy is unthinkable, save in terms of parties. So that's his take on things. We're going to question that. Is that really true? Let's think about that today. Let's begin by defining what we're talking about. Giovanni Sartori, the political scientist who quite literally wrote the book on political parties and party systems, defines a political party as any political group identified by an official label that presents at elections and is capable of placing, through elections, candidates for public office. So to unpack that, a party is a group with a label, it has a name, and it's an organization, so that means it's relatively stable. The key here is that they take part in elections. They are capable of taking part in these elections, and they present their candidates as potential political leaders. Parties were not exactly warmly welcomed by some of the earliest democratic theorists. Indeed, the founding fathers of the United States derided them as factions, and really tried to design American institutions to work against factions. Still, these wise men knew that parties were the cost of liberty. If you take away the absolute ruler and you give humans liberty, they inevitably disagree with one another. Indeed, as James Madison noted of People in General in Federalist No. 10, where no substantial occasion presents itself, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their unfriendly passions. A really rosy perspective on human nature in general, basically the idea that we don't get along with one another. The bottom line here is that parties are seen as factions, and they're seen as a necessary evil, and it's part of democracy, part of giving people liberty. Well, Giovanni Sartori, that political scientist who wrote the book on political parties, has a different view. He notes that the transition from faction to party rests on a parallel process, the even slower, more elusive, and more tortuous transition from intolerance to toleration, from toleration to dissent, and with dissent, to believing in diversity. So notice first here that faction and party are not necessarily the same. Faction being just any division, but party being a certain kind of division. Here, parties are not seen as evil. To be part of a political party in a democratic system is instead to acknowledge that there are differences of opinion, and that those differences are legitimate. The idea is that parties offer voters their different paths, eloquently setting forth alternatives from which to choose. Well, we're not here to make you love or hate political parties, but there are these two sides of the coin. Whether you love or hate them, parties do a lot of the heavy lifting in democratic politics, so let's think for a moment about what they do exactly. First, and most obviously, they try to get political power. Parties are full of politicians, and politicians want to be in political office. A party's whole deal is about getting into political office, and therefore they attract and recruit politicians who, for better or for worse, become our leaders. And of course, they lead political campaigns. This connects to the next function of political parties, and that is to mobilize the voters. Obviously, in their political campaigns, parties are trying to get people to support them, so they are trying to encourage political participation with their get-out-the-vote efforts and attempts to fire up the base, as they say. Moreover, they inform the public, and here I use the word inform as loosely as possible. Whether or not they give us great objective facts about the world is open for debate. Here, inform means more like inform the voters about the options they have. Through their campaigns, parties let voters know the different options they have for their political leaders, and ideally, what they can be expected to do if given political power. They are also an institution of representation, through which people can influence politics. You can affect the political process not only by voting, but also by donating, or campaigning, or making telephone calls, or knocking on doors. And a lot of that is going to go through the organization of political parties. Moreover, they are forums for what political scientists call interest articulation, which basically means tapping into the preferences of the public and conveying them to political leaders. Whether political leaders are genuinely concerned about the same issues as you is somewhat beside the point. They are genuinely interested in finding out what you are interested in and trying to get it to you, so you'll support them. And finally, parties are important within the legislature as a means of governing. If you think about it, in a legislature of 100 politicians, without parties, it is going to be really hard for anybody to get anything done. Each of these 100 politicians will have their own distinct preferences on every little issue. Parties allow these politicians to seek common grounds and to begin negotiating. You find those you are more similar to and those you are different from. Parties allow a way to facilitate a sort of tit-for-tat bargaining, as in, I'll get all of my people to support this issue for you if you get all of your people to support this issue for me. That parties were useful for political elites and legislatures gets back to what Schattschneider said earlier. He is the political scientist whose quote we saw at the top, the one who said that parties created democracy. Parties in the United States and the United Kingdom, the countries where modern democracy developed, started in the legislature because they were tools for legislative representatives. If you think about it, these systems weren't all that democratic by our modern standards a couple centuries ago, as only a tiny minority of the populace, the wealthy, white landowning men, or just the nobility in the UK, could actually vote. But because parties were useful to these rich dudes and because they wanted more power, some of them had an incentive to try and mobilize the public, which helped expand suffrage. So while Schattschneider surely exaggerates a bit, parties certainly played their role in the creation of democracy, just as they are still an important component today. So not all of these functions are always good, and many parties don't do a great job. Still, they do seem to be a constant fixture in democratic governance. It's interesting to try and imagine a modern representative democracy working without parties. Can you do it? At any rate, it hasn't appeared in the real world yet. Parties do not function in a vacuum. Most obviously, they function in opposition to their competitors, other political parties. These interactions are called party systems. A party system includes the patterns of interactions among the political parties in a state. Most obviously, this refers to the number of political parties in a political system. Countries like the United States are called a two-party system because we have two primary political parties. Many other countries have 3 or more political parties, and we'll call those multi-party systems. The number of political parties is not the only factor in characterizing a party system. The party's relative strength is also important. Which parties tend to win and which tend to get edged out? The portions of society voting for each party is also an important factor. Perhaps one party gets all of its support from one demographic, like people living in a certain geographic region or belonging to a certain ethnic or religious group. The ideological makeup is also important. Are the parties in the party system very polarized, or are they virtually indistinguishable from one another? You might be surprised to learn that for a lot of the middle of the 20th century, political scientists criticized the Democratic and Republican parties for being too much alike. They thought that they were like Tweedledee and Tweedledum, indistinguishable and for all practical purposes the same, meaning that they failed to offer American voters a real choice. Now, of course, the American political system seems to look a bit different in terms of ideological makeup. These various attributes of party systems can be very important factors to take into consideration when trying to explain and predict the political behavior of both political elites and voters. These are obviously things that political scientists are quite interested in. But what explains aspects of the party system? Well, there's a lot of things going on here, but we'll just concern ourselves for now with one of the biggest questions about party systems, which is what determines the number of political parties in a party system? Some explanations look at sociological factors, which are certainly extremely important, but since you are all such electoral system experts now, let's focus on the interplay between electoral rules and party systems. Indeed, electoral rules are one of the strongest independent variables used to explain the dependent variable of the number of political parties in a party system. The short version is that majoritarian systems mean fewer political parties, while proportional systems mean more. The root of this relationship is called Duverger's law, named after a famous French political scientist named Maurice Duverger. He noted that majoritarian electoral systems, and especially plurality rules, tend to result in a two-party system. This is because, as mentioned in the last lecture, these rules tend to manufacture majorities. Remember, under plurality rules, the candidate with the most votes gets the seat. So you can win only 30% of the vote, and as long as nobody else gets more than that, you get 100% of the seat. This logic tends to winnow down the number of viable political parties. Let's consider the case of the Liberal Democrats in the UK. Now, you can see from these 2005 election results that plurality systems don't treat third parties very kindly. Labor won 35.3% of the overall popular vote, but the fact that they are the biggest vote earner meant that they got a plurality, that is, more than any competitor, in a bunch of districts. That's why they get a disproportionately large percentage of seats in the UK Parliament. They got a 20% bump. The Conservatives don't do as well. Even though they are right behind Labour in the overall popular vote, they must come in second in a lot, so they get way fewer seats in Parliament. This is what we mean when we say that these systems manufacture majorities. But the poor Liberal Democrats get the real short end of the stick. Really, they aren't all that far behind the other parties in terms of the percentage of votes cast nationally. But because they rarely got the most seats in any one district, they get robbed. Think of it this way. If you get 20% of the vote in every district in a country in a plurality system, that will probably never get you the highest percentage of the vote in any one district, so you don't end up with any seats. Instead, it will tend to go to one of the two main parties, with left-leaning districts being won by Labour and right-leaning districts being run by the Conservatives. So what's the causal mechanism here? Remember, a causal mechanism is the process that links the independent variable, the cause, to the dependent variable, the effect. It's the arrow. Strategic voting refers to the fact that voters get a sense of the electoral rules they are dealing with and they adapt. A citizen votes strategically whenever she votes for a party that's not her number one choice. She'll do so as a contingency to get the second best but more realistic option into office, or simply to keep her worst case scenario out of office. In plurality systems, voters get a sense that the third party is not very viable, so they don't want to waste their vote. Lots of strategic voting occurs here in the US, as people who might think of themselves as Greens will probably vote Democratic because they know their candidate doesn't have a real choice, and Libertarians will likewise often vote Republican for the same reason. The fear is that something like what happened in the 2000 election will happen again, where Ralph Nader ran as a Green and actually attracted a bit of a vote. Of course, it was nowhere near enough to win, but it was enough to deny Al Gore Florida. That is exactly the sort of scenario a strategic voter wishes to avoid. That's how Duverger's law works. Now, are there exceptions? Well, of course there are exceptions. This is social science. There's one circumstance in which smaller parties tend to do well in a plurality system, and that's in the case of regional parties. If you are a party with a strong geographic concentration of support, like the Scottish National Party has in Scotland, and many parties in India have in their home state, you can become a viable electoral force, at least in those regions in which your supporters are concentrated. The logic here is that though you might have only 10% of the total vote in a country, you might have a plurality in the region in which you have your supporters concentrated. So if you're the Scottish Party, you might not be able to win any elections in England or Wales, but you can probably win some of the single-member districts in Scotland. So now we know one very strong factor determining the number of political parties in the state, the electoral rules. Many states in the world with proportional representation electoral rules have multi-party systems, and most states with plurality rules have fewer parties. A lot of them have two-party systems, with some exceptions, particularly in the case of regional parties. Okay, now you are also experts on political parties and party systems. Congratulations. That's all for now. Have a great day.